Well, welcome to today's AMICAL webinar entitled Teaching Multiple Literacies Through Digital Liberal Arts Instruction. I'm Michael Stopel, the User Services Librarian at the American University of Paris. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, Brandon. Good evening, maybe, probably like in the East. The Information Literacy Committee is happy to host today's AMICAL guest speaker, Brandon T. Locke, and I have the terrific pleasure to introduce Brandon today. So thank you, Brandon, for coming. I first crossed him actually through an article. I didn't meet him in person so far, but I'm looking forward to that, hopefully one day.
Yeah, one day.
And that was back in fall 2018 when I came across an article called Digital Humanities Pedagogy as Essential Liberal Education, a framework for curriculum development. And in this article, Brandon connects long-standing liberal arts skills such as information literacy with digital projects, but also like newer literacies such as data and digital literacies. Maybe a little bit more about Brandon. He's a frequent speaker, writer, reviewer about digital humanities, data curation, critical data literacy, information literacy, digital cultural heritage, and digital liberal arts. Today, he's a guest faculty at the University of Washington High School, so thanks for waking up so early in Seattle. And from 2014 and 2018, he was the formerly director of LEADER, the Lab of Education and Advancement in Digital Research at Michigan State University. I guess, Brandon, you're going to talk about this a bit further on. So, okay.
Sure.
And Brandon, he uses a broad range of digital humanities methods, including text mining, oral history, and web mapping. And he teaches workshops on network analysis, data cleaning and organization, archives, and collections. He's also the founder of and co-organizer of Endangered Data Week, an annual series of events to raise awareness of threats to public data. He holds an MLIS from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and an MA in American History. I think it can go on right now for another 20 or 40 minutes, but I won't do that actually because I guess we want to hear more from Brandon himself. But before we start, after Brandon's presentation, we'll have time for Q&As. And there's going to be Livia Piotto from John Cabot University in Rome and Stella Asderi from the American University of Thessaloniki. They're going to help me to facilitate those questions in the chat box. The session will be recorded and we're going to post it afterwards to AMICAL Connect. And then, yeah, of course, finally, before giving the floor to Brandon, I want to say thank you, a big thank you, especially to AMICAL, to Jeff, who made the webinar possible, to Alex Armstrong, of course, for the technical and communication support. And of course, last but not least, the Information Literacy Committee in helping to set up the event. Without their support, I think this would not be happening. So thanks so much, Brandon. It's all yours. Take it away. Here we go.
Right. Thank you, Michael. Let me see. Let me just get the slides up here.
Sure.
Oops. And of course, when I go to do that, I lost the window I had. So good afternoon, and thank you all for joining the webinar. And thank you to the AMICAL team for working with me to get all of this set up and meeting with me to talk about what kind of topics are most important. Let me see here. All right, can you see the slides now?
I see it perfectly.
So, all right, awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. All yours.
All right. So just to build on Michael's introduction, I want to give a little bit more background about myself. From the summer of 2014 until January of this year, I was the director of LEADER, which is a student-focused digital scholarship lab at Michigan State University, and it's located in the departments of history and anthropology specifically. Basically, everything I'll be talking about today is based on my experiences there, and while A lot of my insights are also based on conversations with people at conferences and other articles that people have written. I do want to be clear that this is more of a case study than it is necessarily a broad environmental study. While I was at Leader, Leader was staffed by a team of graduate students from history and anthropology, and also an assistant director, Alice Lynn McMichael. And over the 4.5 years that I worked there, we worked with over 60 different instructors on about 150 courses. So again, just as kind of more background, I know that the idea of a lab embedded within a department is fairly rare. I do think that a lot of the work that we did collaborating with disciplinary faculty is not really any different than a lot of the work that librarians and instructional designers and other digital scholarship specialists can and do perform in many different colleges and universities around the world. So with that being said, I wanted to give a quick overview of the webinar today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by digital liberal arts and why I think framing the digital scholarship in the classroom this way is productive, both in getting faculty buy-in and in developing effective course projects. Then I'll talk about the 4 literacies that I think are helpful in this space and how they can intersect with work in the classroom and life outside of the classroom for students once they graduate. After that, I'll go over a few examples from courses with different levels of engagement that touch on different literacies and how they all sort of fit together as a part of the digital liberal arts. And then finally, I'll talk about some kind of general experiences I've had in working with faculty and talk a little bit about how we can best facilitate those kinds of partnerships and how we can do this kind of work maybe when there aren't a lot of resources at the university, or if this is kind of a new idea at your given college or university. I started on digital humanities, and I think that for better or worse, much of what we might call digital liberal arts is synonymous with digital humanities, or at least overlaps with it in one way or another. And I also think the relative success of digital humanities is a major motivating factor for a lot of this work. And when it comes to this work, it's tempting to emulate some of the projects out there that you really like, but to try to create your own small version of the Colored Conventions Project or Pelagios or anything like that, any of these large digital humanities projects. Again, it can be really tempting, but a lot of the time this approach in the classroom can easily devolve into creating some kind of prefabricated website or project, and then having students kind of doing data entry and not getting a lot out of the process. And we certainly saw a fair bit of that, especially in my first couple of years there. So if we instead think about this process not as, we're going to do a digital humanities project, but we're going to do the humanities work we've been doing for a long time, but it's going to use digital materials and it's going to live online, then I think that opens up a lot of avenues for conversation. And as part of that conversation, we may reflect on some of the disciplinary learning objectives for the courses we're teaching, and also reflect on some of the goals of liberal education. While I think that that liberal arts and liberal education the definitions can be a little slippery and people tend to really not define them, I think this definition I have here on the slide it at least hits most of the high points, right? It's analysis, effective communication, practical intelligence, ethics, and social responsibility. I think that at least kind of overlaps with a lot of people's understandings or working definitions of liberal arts. And when I think about how those skills play out in a lot of digital spaces today, and where I think they'll be in the near future, we can map those goals to a lot of the work that can take place in digital projects. And again, a lot of the work that happens in digital humanities projects as large research endeavors. And thinking about this way, I think makes the instructional design much clearer. It gives us a set of questions for the present or near future. How do we teach students to engage critically with digital materials? How will we prepare them to find and engage with information once they've left the university and they no longer have access to library resources? Can our students engage with materials that are increasingly digital and comprised in data sets? And will students be able to effectively write and argue in the digital sphere? And in fact, I think that framing it as the digital liberal arts this way actually creates kind of a call for necessity of more digital work. A lot of the faculty members I worked with weren't really interested in, digital humanities, but they were interested in students being able to be good online citizens, communicate with digital materials, or to understand or how to determine if a historical or archaeological website is trustworthy. When we're developing these assignments, I think it's really helpful to break down what types of literacy students can develop and to try to focus on that part of the process. This might seem obvious, but when we think about digital humanities projects and we decide we want to develop in the classroom, it's really easy to lose sight of those objectives and design the course to try to produce that bright shining project that you want to emulate, even if you end up sort of missing some of the major learning goals. So I want to talk about 4 different literacies that I see as being productive in the digital liberal arts classroom. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly and get to a couple of examples from classes that I think will illustrate them as well. But if you're interested in more, you can read the article that I wrote a few years ago that Michael mentioned. It's sort of cited on the bottom of the next several slides. So the first one is information literacy. I'm guessing that many on this call are familiar with the concept of information literacy, so I won't go into a whole lot of depth defining it. But I have here on the slide the 6 frames from ACRL's Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education that came out in 2015. And those have sort of guided the way that we've thought about information literacy and the way that our partners in the library have often thought about it and taught it. Information literacy is the bedrock of much of the work that students do, and it's something that can and should come up in every type of class, whether it's digital or not. However, when it comes to digital projects, it can be especially illuminating when it comes to finding sources, determining the source's authenticity and trustworthiness, and discussing the rights a student may have to reproduce that source in a work. These skills, the finding, evaluating, and critiquing, are crucially important to students in their coursework and in their everyday lives. Of course, misinformation is an incredibly pressing issue, and here in the States, we can't stop talking about it. And teaching critical assessment of information and argument on the web is a powerful way to combat that issue. The second literacy is digital literacy. And this is another sort of topic where there are lots and lots of different digital literacy definitions and frameworks out there. I tend to use the American Library Association's definition of digital literacy. They define it as the ability to use information and communication technologies to find, understand, evaluate, create, and communicate digital information, an ability that requires both cognitive and technical skills. So when I think about that sort of materially, I tend to think about it as knowing how to critically consume digital content, how to effectively communicate in digital spaces, including how to write for the web, how to craft a multimodal website, so a website that uses images, text, video, audio, visualizations, things like that. How to edit audio and video, and how to create infographics. But I also think of this as critical thinking about the digitalness of an object, right? It means thinking about the affordances of different types of objects, both physical and digital. Can you feel, if you're looking at, say, an old book, can you feel its heft? Can you read it? Can you word search for things that are in it? Can you annotate or alter it? Can you connect it with other resources? That sort of thing. In the classroom, this work allows for students to think critically about how the design of their writing and the information that they're producing may best serve their argument. In other words, they can think about how they want to structure their writing. Do they want to write long or short paragraphs? Do they want lots of subheaders or none? Do they want to set up a linear argument, or do they want to present their work non-linearly and allow for people to sort of explore? Digital literacy also has some important applications outside of the classroom. I think the ability for students to advocate for themselves, their nonprofits, if they work with one, their own personal activism, their employees or their company on the web, being able to advocate for those things on the web, effectively using the medium, is a life skill that will only grow with importance in the future. I often did informal surveys with students when they came into Leader. And while basically every student uses some kind of social media, we usually only saw 4 or 5 out of a 20-person class who had ever created a website before, and usually at least several of them had only done so in a prior digital humanities class. And while I think that the use of social media is valuable and is, of course, a bit more widespread amongst college students, I think it's important for students to understand how to create things and advocate for themselves on the open web rather than solely relying on social media platforms, which may collect data on them, monetize their content, and can potentially ban or remove their content. The third literacy I want to talk about is data literacy. For many students, particularly those who aren't conducting research in the sciences, data is sort of an abstract idea that they hear about all the time, that they actually see very rarely, and they work with basically never. There are also a lot of frameworks and guides out there for data literacy, but there are a few different approaches that I tend to like. And actually there are 2 sort of different directions to go at this that I think are both helpful in different spaces. The first one is the Creating Data Literate Students project. And that's sort of linked on the second bullet point. And that aims to prepare students to understand the role that data plays in their lives and to give students the ability to work with it effectively. This is actually intended for high school students, but I find that it actually works really well because they're really trying to tie your everyday use of data to the work that you can do in the classroom. And I should also say there's an entire free ebook full of case studies. I think there's 40 or 50, and reflections on all kinds of classrooms and topics. So that's a really helpful resource to think about some of these projects. The framework I've used in some more research intensive classroom situations is the Data Information Literacy Initiative. Although it's designed to teach faculty and graduate students the kinds of things one must know to work with data on large scale research projects, they do have a series of frames that are really helpful if you're just approaching the topic and are trying to think of all of the many different aspects of data that can be really useful. Some of those include sort of an introduction to data formats, metadata, data curation and reuse, data analysis, and data visualization. The value to me in teaching data in the classroom is twofold. First, it fosters really productive conversations about what it is that we're studying and how we can describe or otherwise analyze these objects and what kinds of decisions we may end up being made based on biases within them. So just as a kind of a basic example, something as simple as creating a data set of films or books or newspaper articles, which is something I've done in lots of different classes, can raise a lot of questions about what information should be recorded about them, what questions you may want to eventually ask of the data set, what format that data should take, what kind of controlled vocabulary or uncontrolled vocabulary may be used, and the impact that all of those decisions have on the eventual object and the potential study of it. The second value of teaching data literacy in the classroom is that working with data can help students understand the impact of the data collection and usage on their everyday lives. More and more of our lives are being determined by the collection and use of data, be it in scientific communication, electoral campaigns, in the ads we see on the web, and in policing and the criminal justice system. Just as an example, there are some well-known cases here where there's been an attempt to use what they call predictive policing as a way to objectively determine where police should be focused and where they should be more aggressive with the population. But of course, this predictive policing is trained on data that's created by the overpolicing of Black and brown neighborhoods. So this attempt at objectivity, or supposed objectivity, really only provides justification of the existing biases within the system. It also, working with data also can help students, with their own political advocacy. It can be a helpful skill later in their lives, right? There are myriad uses of data later on. And the final, oops, sorry about that. The final literacy is computational analysis or algorithmic literacy. Computational methods and algorithmic literacy means developing a really basic set of different methods, a really basic sense of how different methods of analysis or other actions can be enacted upon a data set. So this doesn't necessarily mean, turning students into programmers, but instead just kind of helping them think through a couple of steps of some kind of analytical process and helping them kind of understand what people talk about when they talk about algorithms, or when they talk about, black boxes that, take in data and spit out some result. There really isn't a way of understanding what's happening inside. Just as a really basic example, students can think about text mining and not just say, here are the list of the most common words, how can I use that? But to take a step or two beyond that and think about how concordances may be useful in understanding topics or language, or how a part or speech tagger could be used to determine how different writers may have used similar sentence structures, things like that. I also tend to kind of think of this literacy as a kind of next step for either information literacy or data literacy. Just as kind of another example, I had students read part of Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression, and we had a really great conversation about it afterwards. Several of the students had mentioned that they had never really thought about how search results were ranked. And they had no idea that there was actually a really convoluted ranking process that had always been fairly easy to manipulate. They'd always just kind of thought of it as, the top results are always the best, and not gone a lot farther. So again, there's an example of how this can actually build on our information literacy by thinking about the processes that we use to find information. And also on a related note, project information literacy is just starting on an algorithmic literacy process that will develop some recommendations for preparing students to better understand information and its relationship to search and recommendation algorithms. They just mentioned, or they just announced that, I think like 3 or 4 weeks ago. So that report will be coming out soon. So now I want to move on to a couple of examples of workshops or projects that we've done in Leader. There's a lot of variance in the size and scope of classes that worked with Leader. Some were one-off workshops intended to show a particular concept or just kind of challenge students to think a bit differently about the topic. Others had a digital final project where students started working on it in the middle of the semester and had several workshops and sessions that sort of built up to this final project. These different types can obviously limit the amount of development or the scope of learning goals that you can accomplish. But with all of these, I think what's most important is that they're supported by everybody involved, both the teaching instructor and any other sort of specialist that may come into the classroom. And also that it's coherent within the course. Obviously, one-shot workshops can often run the risk of being a little disconnected from the class, and they can sometimes seem like kind of a weird outlier in an otherwise standard class, right? Someone comes in and talks about this topic that's sort of a little different, and then you sort of resume. So that is certainly one danger of the one-shot workshop. So for the first example I have up here, this was an African American history course taught by Dr. Jessica Johnson, where she wanted students to engage with primary source analysis by sort of collecting some images on a website and writing some descriptions, some analysis of the images and how they related to the course. For the most part, this class was a straightforward information literacy session. as much as those exist. I showed them the library website. I showed them some databases that'd be especially good for the class. I showed them how to limit their search to images and how to find licensing information and how they could cite the image. But it was also important to both the instructor and myself that students would learn how to find images on the open web, and they would understand how to assess them and how they could critically engage with those different sites. So we looked at a few false history examples. So just as one example, we talked about how the web is full of sites that claim that there were Black Confederate soldiers, even though they didn't actually exist. There's no evidence. Despite this, when you do a Google search, or at least a couple of years ago when we did this, when you did a Google search, all of the top results would claim that there were Black Confederates, or they would at least appear to support that on a quick reading of it. We also did a quick activity where students critically assessed the website based on who the domain was registered to, what types of citations there are, what kinds of ulterior motives there may be. We also kind of really interestingly stumbled into a historical image that had become a meme. So when you did a reverse image search to try to find sort of the context for the image, it just led to tons and tons of like Imager and Twitter links, all sort of edited to the meme. So we had to go pretty deep to actually find the original source. And we also talked a bit about provenance and the way that many trustworthy archival sources may still have some accuracies or some biases. This sort of broad instruction has I think somewhat become the norm in IL sessions, but several instructors doing similar projects had all indicated that it hadn't really been something that they had thought of until they thought about having students republish these images on the web and having those students' projects kind of live in the open web in the same environment, alongside good historical sites and bad historical sites. And in thinking about that, they actually, came to me asking for an information literacy session. The second example I want to talk about, it's actually two different digital literacy projects that we did in two different anthropology courses, but I think it's helpful to sort of look at them together. In a class on ancient Egypt taught by Dr. Ethan Wattrell, the students co-created a digital atlas of Egyptian archaeology. You can kind of see, I just took an example here. The first one is the main website, and then if you click to see more details about a site, the top right is sort of the way that the site looks, and then the bottom right is the code that the students created to show it. So in this course, through several workshops utilizing codecademy.com, students learned basic HTML and CSS, and through a leader workshop, they learned some basics of GitHub and the functionality of GitHub pages. The students then forked, or forked is essentially GitHub's term for making copy. They forked an HTML file, added information and pictures of their particular site, and filed a pull request to add to the class repository. So in this case, students don't have a lot of decisions to make regarding the structural and aesthetic layout of the site. They're basically filling in, a template. However, they are learning how to use HTML and CSS, which could allow them to do much more customization in future projects. On the other side, students in an anthropology capstone courses, those are kind of the final senior class before you graduate. Students in those classes purchased the domain and server space using Reclaim Hosting and created WordPress portfolio websites from scratch. In the example on the right, the student has continued to use the portfolio website in her PhD program. So this is providing some value, and that students can kind of roll it over to be their personal website. Yeah, so there's the sort of value in keeping that as a personal portfolio. For these courses, students aren't working with code, but they are learning how to go about purchasing a domain, installing a content management system on their own personal server space, and are choosing from a myriad of themes and layouts that they're all able to install completely on their own. And what's I think notable about both of these examples is that students are able to replicate this process afterwards. With both of these, they have a pretty good idea of how to create their own website using either GitHub Pages or WordPress and a hosting service. And I want to differentiate this from a lot of the other projects we've done where students are given credentials to a university hosted WordPress or a AMICAL site or something else. And then they're just kind of shown how to log in and make changes, right? With this here, they more or less get to see the whole process using technologies that are accessible to them outside of the university. And the third and final example I wanted to talk about is a senior seminar on historical data methods that I taught myself last fall. The class was focused on both technical and social aspects of data, critically interrogating the source of the information, understanding the decisions that went into the data set creation, as well as many of the source materials, the way that the information is represented in digital form, and the avenues for visualization and analysis of the data. This really ended up being a class that was at least half information and data literacy, and the other half sort of historical analysis and research. The slide examples I have here are all from the same activity, where we sort of transition from talking about theories of representation and erasure in archives, and started talking about how we transition those kind of complex ideas and entities into machine-readable, well-structured data sets. We also did a little bit of algorithmic literacy in this class. This is the class I mentioned earlier, where we read and talked about algorithms of oppression. We had students reflect on the ways that there were assumptions within their tools that had an impact on their work. So just as one basic example, one student talked about how there are many ways of understanding geography and space, but the digital mapping tool they were using plotted everything according to latitude and longitude using a Mercator projection, right? So given that tool, there weren't a lot of, at least not easy ways to represent different ideas about space or geography, right? There was already assumption that this is how the world is laid out. So I want to close by just talking a little bit more about how these collaborations came together in my experience and how they can come together productively, and how you can do some of these projects without a ton of sort of institutional or material support. When I arrived at Michigan State, we did have several faculty members who were involved in digital research projects of their own in various ways, and who also supported their own digital projects in the classroom. This was really helpful to me because the idea of digital projects wasn't really new to the departments. And while most of the faculty never really participated in it, they had seen a few of the projects and were somewhat familiar with the practice, right? Just getting over that first hurdle can be a challenge in getting things going. My goal in the position was to develop a broader curriculum in these departments, to go from having digital work being a part of a couple of classes each semester to having this be a significant number of courses, and to make it so that our majors at least would have several types of digital courses by the time they had graduated. So I just wanted to give a quick note about our curricular strategy. Ideally, these courses would have worked together to create a more comprehensive program where students can get a series of experiences that all build upon each other. But that wasn't really logistically possible at Michigan State. Michigan State has 55,000 undergraduate students. And with the exception of the anthropology capstone course that I mentioned earlier, all the required courses from both of the majors are taught several times a year by lots of different faculty who had a lot of freedom over the course structure and content. Those courses, the ones required for the major, also have a lot of non-majors, so you couldn't really plan on students in a senior level class having prior experiences in really any of those areas. So for our purposes, we had to just kind of take a scattershot approach and assume that students would come in with no prior experience. Obviously, that's not ideal, but it's sort of what we had to work with. So again, getting back to sort of my goals there, my goal was to integrate digital work into many more courses. And we started with the faculty that were already doing a lot of the work already and were already on board. Excuse me. That helped us to develop a workflow and also create some sample projects that we could point other faculty to. Once we had a few projects out and the faculty that participated realized that we not only took a lot of the stress off them in terms of developing the projects and supporting students, but we also honed in on some crucial disciplinary and technical points. There was a lot of word of mouth and a lot more buy-in from the faculty. Our first semester, we worked with 9 courses, and we managed to hit 20 courses by the third semester before capping the number of courses we would work with at about 20. We also tried to capitalize on some of this word of mouth by having open house project launches. These varied a bit in size and scope, but basically we'd invite faculty and grad students in the departments to come and watch the presentations. And once faculty would see those presentations, they would ask questions, talk to the students afterwards about their experiences. That did a lot to develop more interest in the project, and more faculty started to buy into the idea of doing this kind of work. So now I want to shift a little bit to talk about the collaborations themselves. Developing successful collaborations in academic spaces can be really difficult. There are sometimes some power dynamics at play between faculty and librarians and instructional designers, which is, of course, unfortunate. For faculty, it also means giving up some of their class and potentially leaving their comfort zone, which can very reasonably lead to some uneasiness and reluctance to take part. But I think it's important to come to these conversations and some of these, planning discussions, sort of recognizing that each party involved, potentially there's more than 2 parties, but that each party involved is an expert in a particular area, and those areas of expertise are complementary and beneficial to each other. And once the parties kind of come together with that idea, it can be a lot more productive to talk about learning objectives and plans for teaching and supporting students and those sorts of things. Of course, it's possible to work together in these classes without having this sort of ideal understanding of the partnership. But you do run a greater risk of miscommunication with each other and with students. You can run into unexpected labor and other kind of general hurdles in the process. Some examples we encountered were instructors changing the assignment without really letting anyone, the leader, knowing, or sending students to leader to help when we were not really prepared or didn't really know what was happening in the class. Sometimes faculty were unhappy with the quality of the instruction that had taken place in leader, and in other cases, the instruction that the instructors had expected us to talk about one thing and we were talking about another. And sometimes students got overlapping, conflicting, or missing information about the process from both the instructor and from someone in leader. There are a couple of ways to mitigate this. We held a few workshops for instructors. Sometimes they were real brief discussions at faculty meetings, and sometimes they were sort of a larger opt-in event where I would talk about some of the past courses. I talk about what we were most excited about doing in leader, but hadn't seen yet, and to kind of set expectations for how the collaborations would go and what we could and could not be expected to do in leader. This was a good way to sort of get ahead of one-on-one conversations and set the tone for this kind of collaboration. And of course, it was another way to do outreach for instructors. I would also recommend some kind of memorandum of understanding for these partnerships. It doesn't necessarily need to be like a formal signed document or anything like that, but even just a shared email where after your meeting, you write up all the relevant details. How many sessions will each person be participating in? What will they be teaching? Who will students go to with questions? what are the due dates, that sort of thing. And having that sort of written document, again, even if it's just kind of an email, putting it all out there, helps to keep everyone on the same page and to sort of remind each other of what the expectations are and who is taking the lead on what. These partnerships can be a lot of work, but they can also lead to even more fruitful collaborations down the road. I don't know if this is a fluke, but when I started, a bunch of faculty members came to me asking me to show students databases. These were faculty who hadn't really been reaching out to the library to do information literacy sessions. But for whatever reason, when I sort of showed up in the department, that was something that they had realized they wanted in their classroom. So just by starting that conversation, we ended up referring a lot of people to the library. We ended up kind of creating a pipeline for more information literacy sessions in places where there weren't. And so finally, just in terms of doing this work where there isn't a lot of infrastructure, again, I landed in an institution with an ample amount of both material and human support for digital work. But I do think that there are ways to gain a foothold without much of either. In terms of material support, you know, I have to be honest, having a server does make a lot of this significantly easier to be able to put up your own projects on the web. But there is a lot you can do without institutional support. Students can talk through the creation of a data set in class. A lot of great work can happen on, you know, pieces of paper with pencil or on marker boards or in a shared, you know, Google spreadsheet type of thing. And they can use web-hosted tools for analysis. I have a lot of the links here on the slide, but they can use things like Flourish or Voyant to do some data analysis. They can use GitHub to host their own websites. There at the bottom are two kind of emerging platforms for digital collections that take advantage of GitHub as a host. So there are those sort of opportunities out there. In terms of human support, I'm a big believer in the ability to snowball these projects and grow interest through discussing the experiences. If you're a librarian or instructional designer, you just need to find one or two instructor allies to put together an idea and talk to others about the results. And if you're an instructor, you just need to find a librarian or instructional designer to put something together to support some of the digital work and then kind of share your results with others. And finally, I just want to add that it's really important to keep in mind that you don't have to throw out the entire syllabus and try to completely redo it as a digital class. You can always start by making a few small changes here and there, a website instead of a paper, critical readings of digital projects and data sets as a part of the class, or some extended information literacy sessions that can dig a little deeper than just the library databases. These small experiments can provide a lot of insights into what may or may not work while still developing some of these critical literacies for students. So thank you all for your attention. I want to kick it back over to Michael now for some questions.
Thank you, Brendan. That was very interesting. I almost have the feeling that I'm part of your lab right now. I can, so that's gonna start my video again.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for all the description. I'm almost intimidated right now to ask questions, but maybe if somebody, I'm looking right now in the, I'm not sure if I can see my chat box. I'm not sure. But everybody's free right now to ask questions if you have questions. Yes, Stella?
Yeah. Yeah, so we have one question from Nyla Jargos. So her question is, where does a librarian start in order to be able to support faculty teaching courses with digital humanities integrated projects?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there are a few different directions you can go. For one thing, I think that at the core of so many DH integrated projects are really a lot of kind of basic ideas of librarianship, like what metadata is, and some critical approaches to thinking about the representation of artifacts or things with data that I think are fairly widespread amongst librarians. To go a little bit more technical, one thing that I recommend, although it's expensive and time consuming, is different sort of summer schools or institutes. I know that there is an upcoming institute in Beirut, of course. But those are good places to go to develop some critical skills if you are in need of them. I know that there's in addition to the one in Beirut, oh no, I'm blanking on it. There's one in Germany that I'm blanking on. There's also the DH Summer School in Oxford. Oh man, one of my friends teaches in Germany and I can't remember what it is. So those are good opportunities. I would also, let me grab a URL that I'll put in. I'd also recommend Programming Historian for, again, a lot of the more technical aspects. There. They have, I don't even know, I think they may have up to 100 at this point, different tutorials on different sort of technical tasks. And they are, oh yeah, Leipzig, thank you. And they are starting to do more translations. They have a number of them in Spanish, and I think a few days ago they launched a site in French. So they're working on translating a lot of these projects into other languages. But that is that's a really helpful space. I also think there are a growing number of resources on the web in addition to Programming Historian, where people write their own tutorials, discuss the work that they've done, that sort of thing. So again, I think that on the back end there are a lot of these technical resources, but again, I think the first place to start is to just talk with faculty and get an understanding of where their needs are, and then just working from there and trying to kind of figure out where you need that additional training.
Yeah, actually, I was looking for the chat box. I was like trying to. I had a question, like a bit about you're talking about the curriculum development as well. About the I think that's something like getting a series of experiences, and maybe could you tell what's worked quite well? What stood out like out of your experience right here most? I saw also, like these 4 different projects that you had, like especially the last one about the data and the algorithm. From my perspective as a librarian, I won't have time enough to have students read about the oppressions of algorithm, which is a very interesting book, and I would love to my students maybe to read it. So there's some. But for me, what's always interesting is like the curriculum development, like the series of experiences where students can build on, and maybe also like for students, what was right here like a huge success. What you would maybe can speak a bit to that.
Yeah. First, I would say there are a number of liberal arts colleges here in the States that I know of that have. I think they usually call them digital fellowships, where they have a cohort of students who take a series of courses. Sometimes it's maybe only 2 or 3 courses over their career. In other cases, it's 2 courses every year for all 4 years. Where students will they sort of have a set curriculum where you start with like an intro to digital humanities class, and then you do a text analysis class, and then you do a mapping class. And then by the time you're done with the program, you have this big project that you've worked on for, multiple semesters. And, that's maybe the shining ideal of sort of doing this curricular development. But I think in a better, in a more manageable space, what I would have liked to have done is have, like for history, there's history 250. I think that's right. Now that I'm gone, I'm forgetting the course numbers, but there is a requirement that all students all majors take the course, and a lot of non-majors would take it. It's a historical methods course, and I think just integrating some of these skills into courses like that are sort of the entrance to a major, go a long way. And then being able to have more in-depth work on the 300 or 400 level, where you have a pretty good understanding that everyone in there has taken this class. They have, just for example, they have made some basic maps before. They understand what metadata is. They feel comfortable working in a spreadsheet, something like that. And then at the 300 or 400 level, you can do some more in-depth visualizations. You can have them curate their own data set. You can have them make their own website, a multimodal website that they have a ton of freedom. They can sort of design and go off on their own and do something really creative. I think that's sort of the ideal, is creating those sort of pathways where you can expect that students can take a series of courses where you can kind of build on each other.
Okay, so that means that with your answer now, we also answer to Vanessa's question about having the projects that you work on focusing on students later in their degree. Okay, so when they have more literacies and skills developed.
Yeah,
Do you have any examples of successful works? I think you also presented a few as well.
mm-hmm. Yeah. Right now I'm just pasting in a site. This sort of gets at the first question, actually. But these are most of the tutorials that we've put together in Leader, at least over the last couple of years. So there are a number of repositories like that where you can take a look at some of the tutorials. Actually, I probably should have linked to this instead. Okay. To get to the examples of successful workflows, I don't know. Let me think about that for a moment. I don't know that there are necessarily, yes, thank you. I was scrambling to find that. I don't know that there are some clear kind of like workflows that I could point to. I think a lot of it really depends on sort of the context for the class, and I think that they vary a lot based on who's in the course and what some of the goals are. I would say one resource that I think is also really helpful. Instead of finding the link, I'll just write it out. Miriam Posner has a series of blog posts that were also later published in the DH Commons journal, and it's called "How Did They Make That?" And those sort of they take a lot of these popular projects, digital humanities projects, and break it down and say like, okay, so what kind of sources are they using? What kind of technology are they using to put that on the web? And she sort of gives you an idea of how you could create that on your own. And I think that looking at some of those is really helpful to kind of understand how those projects come together. And I also think that approach to studying digital humanities is really helpful. I think it's a good way of sort of critically reading these projects, is looking at them and sort of breaking them down according to those different things and trying to make sense of how they were put together. Does that make is that an answer to the question, Naja? If I'm not sure if I've exactly answered that. Thank you.
I have a question about the multiple literacies right here. So there's like, I have the feeling that there's lots of things going on based in the end in the classroom. And I was wondering, well, maybe a trick question, which of the literacies, is there Are they all going together? How do you manage? Is there like a kind of a chronological order? What do you emphasize more? How is the collaboration working? For me, that's all interesting aspects. Also with regard then to the maybe the assignment development that you mentioned also at the beginning. Maybe can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. To answer your first question, really what it comes down to is what the instructor we were working with is comfortable with doing. It depends on what kind of project they're looking for and sort of how much time they're willing to give into it. I think that there is kind of a clear hierarchy that starts with information literacy. Like I said, kind of always in every class if possible. And I think digital and data literacy can certainly be complementary, but I think that that at least in our experience, you know, within somewhat limited space, it would usually be one or the other. And then I also think that the computational analysis, again, sort of sits on top and can kind of build on either. I think it's probably pretty difficult to just jump to computational analysis without talking about the things before it. So that's sort of like how I imagine it functioning. In terms of you know, priorities or you know, fitting them all in, I think it's, you know, it's impossible to give all of them. It's impossible to do a lot on all of the literacies all in the same classroom. There are, so for example, in the historical data class that I taught, we did a ton of work on digital literacy and information literacy and some on computational analysis, but you know, they produced websites, but what it really was at the very end of the semester, we said, okay, here's a WordPress account, put your results there, right? So they weren't, you know, there really wasn't the time and sort of mental capacity for them to really think about creative or innovative ways to, you know, put stuff on the website, because they were focusing so much more on sort of the research process. And at the same time, when we've had students create multimodal projects, the amount of teaching that can take in terms of teaching audio or video editing, teaching some of the more intricate ins and outs of web development, you know, even if it's just how to customize WordPress, you know, those take some time to show them sort of all the different options. And once you've done that, it's really difficult to dig into, you know, talking about data or something like that. So I think, you know, you tend to kind of pick one or two that you want to focus on and sort of, you know, hope that you catch the rest later on.
Okay, I saw that there's Aziz. He raised his hand. Maybe we can. I'm gonna maybe unmute. Can I unmute? Yeah, I think you're unmuted. We cannot hear you, Aziz. So maybe you're gonna have to ask a question in the chat box. Otherwise, maybe yeah. So that would be then like the question. Is there another question? I think we're gonna take one more questions or two questions when we're gonna get like Aziz's question. And then I have like one question, and I'm coming back right here to the assignment a little bit. In a way, sometimes when I think about these digital liberal arts projects, I'm somehow in a way saying that I'm just, you see, you talked about instead of writing a paper, creating a website. And maybe some people might say that this is, well, it's just like a different format, but there's qualitative, maybe nothing new. You see, there's still like the liberal arts skill of writing something, but basically we're just changing the format right here. So maybe can you speak to my fear right here about this kind of exercise? So that would be.
Yeah, we it was pretty common, particularly at the start, that we would discover that students would write a paper in Microsoft Word and would then, you know, the day before it was due, log in to their site and just kind of paste it all out, which is not what we were going for. So I think the important things to think about or the important things to emphasize when you want to do that kind of substitution of like doing a website instead of a paper is to make sure that the writing is being done sort of digital first, that they're thinking about how many pages how many different web pages they want to have, how those are structured. Is there a hierarchy? Like maybe it's just me, but I just love like talking about like the navigation and like embedded links and that kind of thing, because I think it's a really interesting way of suggesting to readers that there is an expected order and the information fits together in a hierarchy, but you're also giving readers sort of the option to choose what they want. So I think talking about that and also trying to emphasize in some cases building around some ethnographical interviews that they have done, building around a few newspaper articles, that they want to highlight. I think building around the sort of a digital first web writing is really important, and not having students, write everything out and then push it to the web.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I see. Okay. I don't know if actually I'm still going to have like a couple of questions, but then we're going to go over time, I can imagine. I'm looking at the chat boxes. Did Aziz ask a question, or maybe you're going to hear him now? Otherwise, I would start wrapping up. Livia, do you have any questions on your side, or Stella? No? Otherwise?
I think Drago was very comprehensive. He covered everything.
I think so too. So then we're going to come to an end. We're going to wrap up. It's already like 1 minute over the time. Thanks so much, Brandon, for your time, for waking up that early. That was, like lots of information. I'm still going to have many questions for you. For further information, of course, to everybody, you're going to find the recordings on AMICAL Connect. We're going to set that up after the event. Then I hear your dog in the background. Is that your dog, Brandon? So he's got to be.
I hope that's a neighbor dog. I don't know if that's mine or not.
But then thanks so much to Seattle. I hope you're going to have a nice day. And thanks so much to everybody as well for attending.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.